Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you all for coming out on this frigid night. And I want to thank the Housing Works bookstore for hosting us. My name is Carrie Butler. I'm the interim president of the Municipal Art Society. Our former president is here joining us. Sorry. Off track. And MAS is thrilled to be collaborating with Housing Works on the series of book talks celebrating New York City life and culture and history. If you don't know about MAS, we are a 132-year-old civic advocacy institution in New York City. We do deep research and advocacy around the issues that affect New Yorkers, from urban design, development, and preservation and policy. We also like to celebrate diverse cultural heritage of the beautiful city with events like the one tonight. Do we have anyone from the Bronx? Amazing. Okay, we're in for some good questions, I think. So tonight's book is Paradise Bronx, written by Ian Frazier, who's sitting here on the right, and was 15 years of walking through the Bronx and exploring the rich history, the built environment, the places that make the Bronx unique, and the people, of course, and I think really captured the spirit and resilience of all the neighborhoods and the residents of that amazing borough. And as of course most of you probably know, Ian Frazier is a frequent contributor to the New Yorker magazine, and he also wrote Travels in Siberia and On the Res. And in conversation with Ian is Boris Kachka, senior editor at The Atlantic and former books editor of LA Times, and who also wrote Hot House, a cultural history of the publisher Farrar, Straus and Giroux, which is also Ian's publisher, so unique coincidence there. And so we're going to start with a reading and then followed by discussion, question, answer period, and after which you'll be able to purchase the book if you haven't already and get it signed. All right, I'm gonna pass this along.
What I'm going to read is a brief part at the beginning of the book. Probably no more need to be said about it. The Bronx is a hand reaching down to pull the other boroughs of New York City out of the harbor and the sea. Its fellow boroughs are islands or parts of islands. The Bronx hangs on to Manhattan and Queens and Brooklyn, with Staten Island trailing at the end of the long tow rope of the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, and keeps the whole business from drifting away on a strong outgoing tide. No water comes between the Bronx, if you leave out its own few islands, and the rest of North America. The Bronx is the continent, and once you're on it, you can go for thousands of miles without seeing ocean again. The other boroughs, for their part, cling to the Bronx for dear life. The chafing and strife of this connection have made all the difference to the Bronx. The northernmost part of the Bronx's western border is the Hudson River. Then Manhattan fits up next to the Bronx on its western side for more than half its length, lying approximately north and south. Here, the Harlem River, which is a strait and not a river, and which connects the East River to the Hudson, runs between the two boroughs. Steep hills and bluffs rise above the Harlem River Valley. Much of the Bronx is hilly. Stone ridges extend like tendons, knuckles, and fingers from the northern border of the borough southward. These discourage the construction of east-west roads and make the Bronx difficult to cross from east to west even today. After the Harlem River branches off around one side of Randall's Island, a smaller tidal stream, the Bronx Kill continues along the borough's southern border. Going along the top of Randall's, the Bronx Kill also flows into the East River, which is part of Long Island Sound, which is part of the Atlantic Ocean. The Bronx's entire eastern border is the East River and the Sound. Thus, the borough has a major river that comes from inland, the Hudson, to its west, and salt water on its east. Some of the Bronx is rocky and wooded like upstate, and some is oceanfront, marsh, and beach. A straight line with a few bureaucratic zigzags marks the Bronx's northern border. That line is also the border of New York City. In general, people in the suburbs to the north of this line are richer than most people in the Bronx. By some measurements, large areas of the Bronx are poorer than anywhere else in the nation. But that assumes a population frozen in time. Everybody has to start somewhere, and the poor parts of the Bronx are often where people start when they have very little. They work and earn, and in time, they may move upward, and new arrivals take their place. This cycle has tended to wear out some areas of the Bronx. The Bronx is the part of New York where the city merges into the rest of North America. The process has never gone smoothly.
Thank you for that. It's a pleasure to do this. I'm so excited. It's a fascinating book. I think something that you're gesturing at from the very beginning is something that struck me throughout the book, which is that the Bronx has an in-between quality that kind of shaped its destiny from the Revolutionary era onward. I guess I wanted to talk about how that in-betweenness defines the Bronx for you.
Well, I mean, it is a place in between. It's a place that people go through to get to somewhere else. And it's also a place where 1.5 million people live. So you're living in a place that is a kind of transit area. And it's always been in between. I mean, since Europeans came. And one of the parallels that I find in my book is that when Jimmy Carter was here and took his famous drive through the Bronx, which people have written about just in the last couple of weeks because of Carter's death, that was a really dark time. That was 1977. And 34,000 fires burned in the Bronx in 1976. So the Bronx was basically on fire, and Jimmy Carter stood in rubble at the corner of Boston Road and Charlotte Street. Well, looking back at the history of the Bronx, and particularly the Revolutionary War, I found a quote from a chaplain for the Continental Army from 1777, on the Boston Road, in fact. This chaplain stood on the Boston Road and described desolation. Houses burned, fences thrown down, no cattle around because they'd all been stolen, incredibly depressed residents who'd had things stolen and had their houses plundered. The Americans were to the north of what's now the Bronx, and the British were in the south, what's now the South Bronx. And in between was no man's land. So that was an early instance of in-betweenness that kind of presaged the destruction that would happen 200 years later. And both of those times came because of the Bronx in-betweenness. The fires, I think, were directly related to the highways that were pushed through the Bronx and buildings that were torn down, the neighborhoods that were destroyed. So in both cases, this place in between suffered for being in between.
And yet the title of the book is Paradise Bronx. Switch?
There we go.
Which I know from the book refers to eras during which the Bronx could be considered a paradise, despite this in-betweenness, despite the many troubles suffered over the years. Can you talk about I think there were two main eras when it achieved that state of what you'd consider a paradise. Talk about those.
Well, in the 19th century, in fact, this is the anniversary year of the opening of the Erie Canal. And the Erie Canal was like the greatest idea that any city ever had. And it brought a huge amount of wealth to New York City. New York City became a granary city. And people got really rich suddenly. I mean, it was a place with a lot of money and a place with a lot of rich people, and they bought estates in the Bronx. And if you read descriptions of those kind of Arcadias where they had, you know, these unbelievable gardens and really eccentric and interesting estates, some of the houses from those times, Wave Hill, which is a great house up there, that still stand. And at that time, it was more like kind of a Hamptons, you know, paradise. In the 20th century, the subways went to the Bronx. The subways reached the Bronx from 1905 to, there was still, they were putting in the B and the D train, I think, in the 20s. But in that period, the subways got to the Bronx, and they weren't going anywhere else. They were just going to the Bronx. And that was like putting a sprinkler matrix out there, and the whole borough flourished. Apartment buildings sprang up along all of the subway lines. And the subways made it very easy to get to Manhattan, where most people work. Most manufacturing was in Manhattan now. It made it easy to get to the Garment Center, where a lot of Jewish immigrants had found their first jobs. And it just kind of created this place that was the front stoop Bronx that you hear about. And the final ingredient was when they paved the streets. They started paving the streets in like starting around 1910. But there weren't any cars. And so there were these unbelievably new kinds of places for kids to play. And so what you read about of the stickball games or the other games that kids were playing on the street, it was just this feeling of like you could walk out your door and you're in a community and you can go all over the place, and people you know are sitting on your stoops, and your friends are all, I mean, the descriptions of them are, of those days at that time, are really romantic, and people remember them with great nostalgia. And so those are two kinds of, I mean, the second Paradise Bronx, the kind of the urban suburban Bronx, is the one that I would say appeals the most to me. It seems like a Jane Jacobs kind of paradise. This is how people should live in a city.
So there's a story about that's been told about how and when the paradise ended that I mean, in some cases feels blatantly racist, and I think one of the things that you do in the book is really put the lie to that by saying that paradise did not, the multiracial mix of the Bronx actually extended the paradise, and it was only later neglect that ended that paradise. Am I characterizing that?
Yeah, I mean, if you know, you can find lots of interviews where people say, oh, there were all different kinds of people here and we got along and it was great. And what you had a series of immigrations or arrivals in the Bronx. You had an enormous influx of Jews from the Pale of Settlement in Russia, where suddenly Russia just decided to be even worse to the Jews than they had been before. And there were pogroms, and there were, I say in the book, the first memory of Izzy Bayline was of seeing Cossacks burn his village. That was as a young guy, that was the first thing he remembered. And when he came here, he became Irving Berlin. And there were lots of people whose it was almost like you had brought people who were subject to predators into a place where there weren't Cossacks and there weren't predators. And there was an enormous flourishing of, the Bronx was like 50% Jewish in 1930. So you had that kind of baseline, and there had already been German, Irish, Italian immigration. So you had a mix already, and then you had the Great Migration with lots of black people coming up from the South, and then you had Puerto Ricans moving. Once you had airplanes and you didn't have to sit on a boat for 5 days to get here, and once suddenly Puerto Rico was subject to a lot of agricultural reforms that put people out of work, you had millions of Puerto Ricans coming. So suddenly you have all these different cultures in this place. And the Bronx was always, for some reason, quite a musical place. And so you had different blends of music. You had all different kinds of, Latin jazz. You had doo-wop. You had all kinds of music, and then eventually you get West Indian immigration in the 60s after that particular racist law that was passed in 1924 was changed, and you could admit people from countries with black populations. And suddenly the West Indians bring these massive speakers and a kind of dance culture that was a little bit different. And so you had kind of R&B combining with just speakers that'll knock you down. And you got hip hop. And to me, hip hop was a response to the damages that were done, the damage done to the Bronx in the 50s and 60s. Hip hop was invented in the Bronx. And I don't think, without the all the different people that showed up in the Bronx, I don't think you would have had such a fertile place where you would get these different musical styles. And I mean, hip hop is an invention that, what else did New York do at that level in pop music? I mean, and it was invented by kids. It was the only musical form invented, or the only pop musical form that was invented and begun by, people in their teens, which I just think it's the greatest achievement. And so, I mean, that's just kind of an idea about what people will say, well, the urban renewal moved a lot of poor blacks to the Bronx and that destroyed the Bronx. And it was just not, it was an unfortunate, urban renewal had its own terrible disadvantages, but basically this was a place of ferment culturally that only got better as the number of different, ethnic groups grew.
Speaking of correcting the record, I think that I thought, and some people that I've talked to that I consider are pretty, well educated about these kinds of issues, like that arson was a really big factor in the fires in the 70s. I was surprised to learn that it was so rare, and that in fact it was the lack of maintenance and the neglect of the buildings and overcrowding that caused them.
Right. Well, what I said before about the subways coming in. When the subways came in the early part of the century, these apartment buildings just went up like weeds. People were building these apartments all, and they would be row buildings, so that, they would be connected like through the very tops of the buildings. And this was in, the 19-teens and 20s. Well, then you get 50 years later, and you aren't having maintenance, but people are unable to maintain the buildings. That was what caused the fire. There were lots of people living in apartments designed for fewer people. There were lots of appliances that overloaded the wiring. There were, and then there was redlining, which made it impossible to improve your building because you couldn't get a loan to improve it. And all of those things combined to create this situation where fires just happened and the city had decided to neglect it. And everybody kept saying it was arson. And there was arson. But if you go to fire marshals reports, it was like 6% of the fires or something like that. It was not, the fires were not caused mainly by arson. There were arson fires, but there was a lot of many other factors that caused these fires to start. And then the city just sort of decided, well, we're going to let it burn. You know, the idea was that there was this insane to me idea called planned shrinkage. That you were going to make New York City a white-collar community, a white-collar city, and you were going to have, or Manhattan anyway, and you weren't going to provide services to certain parts of the city. It was just insane. They were going to close subway stations. I mean, and they actually did move firehouses. They closed firehouses at the time that the fires were really burning. So, I mean, there's a great movie. I always recommend people to see it. It's called Decade of Fire. It's made by a woman from the Bronx and two colleagues. This woman is named Vivian Vasquez. She grew up in the South Bronx. She saw the buildings burning, and she said, "Are we doing this? I don't know anybody that's doing this. How come people tell me it's us that are the problem?" And a lot of people were saying that. Even, you know, the great Senator Moynihan was kind of, well, if the people of the Bronx, they don't need housing. If they needed housing, why are they burning it down? Well, they weren't burning it down.
So I think I'm trying to find like a theme that joins together all your books. Of course you can't. You follow your heart, but you know there are other books that you've written about. You know, if the Bronx is a drive-over country, you know, there's the flyover country, the Great Plains and the reservations, and Siberia is kind of obviously a lesser-known, forgotten place. Is that something that animates you? That you're, well, nobody really knows about this place. I want to really get to know it and the people in it.
Well, I mean, when people are telling me that the Great Plains are flyover country, I mean, there's so much cool stuff there. And I had traveled all over when I was a boy. My parents were great continental. They drive from Cleveland to Tucson, Arizona, and without stopping. And I was very. I saw these cool places out there. I worked on a ranch in Eastern Wyoming, you know, and it's not, I mean, flyover country does not do it justice. If you remember Spy magazine, which was out so many years ago, they had a map of the U.S. where they put all the kind of bad things about various places on the map of the U.S. And right in the middle of the Great Plains, they put this, like, big letters that said boredom zone. And I just felt like, no, I'll teach you boredom zone. You won't be able to put this down. And I just was reading a poem by Robert Lowell, and he's standing down. It's called The Mouth of the Hudson, and he's standing down on the west side and looking across the Hudson, and he says something like, shelved factories, it's like bake in the sulfurous sun, in the unforgivable landscape. Well, I live in Egypt. What's so unforgivable about it, the landscape? And I can see how you can look at it and see it as sort of dreary, but I just, when people dump on places, they're always wrong. And that's just a crazy statement, but I feel that. And so that makes me want to defend New Jersey, but particularly Siberia, when like you're in a restaurant and they go, oh, he's sitting over in Siberia. Because it's next to the condiments or something. That's like a bad place to sit. But it's like you're going to use a place to be a synonym for something bad. Like you told me that, don't they refer to like slums in Italy as una Bronx? Well, I mean, where's that at? You know? I mean, the Bronx is great. Don't call your slum a Bronx. So all of that, I take it as kind of a challenge, and I try and I just try and make people like think about it differently, and I've written a lot about places, and I kind of wonder if I can write about anything else.
When you did your research, you must have read every book written about the Bronx.
I read a lot of them, but probably, no, there are a lot of them.
Okay, well, the ones that
Yes.
you did read,
Yeah.
that you did read, did you get a sense that they were missing something? And what was that thing?
No, I didn't. I mean, a lot of the books helped and pointed me in the right direction, you know. Lloyd Oltan, the official historian of the Bronx for like 27 years or something, published a book called The Beautiful Bronx, and he published it in 1978. When the Bronx was just well known as not beautiful, and he just defied it. And so, and there are a lot of good histories of it. There are other good histories of the Bronx. A historian named Stephen Jenkins published a book in 1912 that, I mean, it made it seem like this is a really important, significant place. And there's a book called History in Asphalt, where the author walks the Bronx the way I did. I mean, I set out to walk 1,000 miles in the Bronx. This author went all over and got the name of everything, all the streets, everything. And then with such love and care and conscientiousness, he goes behind like what this street is named now, what this street was named before, you know, why the name, why we have this name, you know, and so I can't say that I found a lot more books that got the point of the books. Something like Bonfire of the Vanities, that was another thing I wanted to kind of answer, because the guy takes one wrong turn off the Bruckner, and that's it. His life totally changes, and he lives in catastrophe the rest of his life because he didn't stay on the Bruckner. It's like the idea that what's around the freeways is some kind of, you know, toxicity, and it is, I think, a beautiful book, and I mean, his descriptions are unbelievable, and that makes it kind of the more painful that the Bronx was used in that way to be just like a behavioral sink area of catastrophe. And there were movies that did that, and there were a couple movies that did that. Fort Apache, the Bronx, which was protested by people in the Bronx quite rightly. So that was the area. It was like kind of the media idea, or the idea that the Bronx was some horrible place was also in books. And I guess, to be fair, I read The Bonfire of the Vanities right when it came out, and I had to hunt for the other books. You know, I had to go up to the Bronx, had to go to the Bronx Historical Society. I had to buy Lloyd Oltan's book at the Bronx Historical Society because it wasn't for sale anywhere else. So I guess it did require some sort of getting into it and searching out, because there were so many things that they just couldn't be right. It just didn't seem right to me, even though you know, that was what everybody said. People would say to me, you know, well, is it safe to go up there? And I mean, when I never had any problem. People were incredibly nice. You know, people call me Poppy when I'm walking around, or people call me Boss, and why am I Boss? You know, and they'll say, "Look out, Boss! I don't run you over or something." It's a friendly. My experience has been it's a friendly, nice place. And if I sit on a bench in the Bronx, I'm an old guy sitting on a bench in the Bronx, and there are plenty of others doing that. And I found it an easy place to I was comfortable there. So, long answer.
No, this is wonderful. I think it's easier for me. I think another kind of overriding sense I have reading it is that it's kind of like you're walking around with, you know, remember the Google Glass, and you know you're seeing what's happening, and then you're seeing what happened in that street it's kind of like a double vision, superimposition of what happened there historically. And I don't think everyone sees things that way. In fact, you're always asking people on the street, did you know that Sonia Sotomayor grew up on the street? And they don't seem very interested.
They are.
I mean, how does that make you feel that you have this unique perspective, and then sometimes people don't even really care to hear about it on the
No,
street?
it is bizarre, because like, I'll go to a place and I know what was there before. I mean, I go to a place and I know there was an Indian village here. And I know Sawano Indian people lived here. And I've read about digs, archaeological digs that took place here. And I know that all these different things that I've read in these archaeological papers that were done back in the 19-teens when they were building in the Bronx. People also did, excavations. And to me, I just think, this is so incredible. And, they found all kinds of arrowheads here. They found pottery. They found elk bones. I mean, when was the last elk here? They found all kinds of, just cool stuff right here, and now there's a house here. And it's a perfectly okay house, or there's a bodega here. And I will occasionally say, do you know what was here? And people are like, it is almost never really certainly not as interesting to them as it is to me. But to me, the point is, you experience time in a way. You have to experience time as A, B, C, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You have to experience it sequentially, because you're a living person. You're here and you're going to go eventually, and that's how you experience time. But when you step out and you can experience time as like, here we are now, here we are in 1777 in this same place where Jimmy Carter stood. Here we are now in 1643 when Anne Hutchinson was killed here in this place right next to the New England Thruway, I-95, in the very northern part of the Bronx. And I just think, Anne Hutchinson was here, and now it's like, no. And I just think, I'm out of time now. It's almost the way God would see something. I see this, and if you imagine the way God would see it, I know this is going to be here, and I know that's going to be there, and I know what's here. And to me, it's intoxicating, but it isn't to most people. And so I kind of find myself, I like it when I do find, some people do find it interesting. That's what archaeologists find interesting. If I hadn't been a writer, I think I would have been an archaeologist.
Well, I think a lot of people do find it interesting. So from your godlike perspective, if you could spend any day in the history of the Bronx, can you pick one?
Oh, definitely. I would pick May of 1975. I'm trying to make sure I got the year right. At Cedar Playground, it's on Cedar Avenue, way up in the north. It's next to the Harlem River, but it's not. It's before the Harlem River turns and heads west. It's right sort of at that point, but it's in the very, very far western part of the Bronx, and it's in the canyon of the Harlem River, and it's where a famous hip-hop jam happened on a particular night. And I read about it in Grandmaster Flash's autobiography. And he's coming to this jam, which he hears from a distance. He's only heard about this by earshot. And they say, you gotta check this out. Cool Herc, who was even before Grandmaster Flash, is having a jam. The speakers are so big, he's hooked them into the street lights, he cranks it up, the street lights dim. There are hundreds of people in this fairly small, it's 4 basketball courts, 4 basketball baskets. so it's 2 courts, jammed in there, everybody dancing. And Grandmaster Flash, whose name is Joseph Sadler at the who at the time was Joseph Sadler and not Flash, but is so fascinated with this. And he says he's blocks away, and he hears it, and he gets closer and closer, and he says, and I'm paraphrasing it, he says it was not only the loudest music he ever heard, it was the loudest sound he ever heard. And it kind of reminds me of Spinal Tap, you know, like the loudest band in the world. But there's a reason for that volume, and that was invention. That was an invention that was going to go around the world, and it was outside, so you could see, like I say, like of the Cool Herc jam that he had in the playing fields of Taft High School, which is vast open playing fields with lights on them. I said when he had one of those jams, it could have been seen from space. And it went, the fact that it was this outdoor thing very much at the beginning. So, Cedar Playground is the one place I would be at the time that Cool Herc was doing his jams there. And I'm always saying, put up more plaques. We need plaques. I want there to be a plaque in Cedar Playground. I would love it if that would be possible. And I don't know who's in charge of plaques, but that would be the place and the time out of all the times. And I was in the city then. I just didn't know. I lived in the city in 1974 or 75. But I didn't know anything of what was going on.
You spend a lot of time writing about people who are not usually included in sort of grand histories of places, which are the organizers who took it upon themselves to rebuild. I mean, it's striking that there's a lot of attention paid to it. I guess my question around that would be kind of when you decided that that had to be a significant part of the story.
Well, that was really an overlooked part of the story. I mean, nobody knew who rebuilt the Bronx. I mean, if you knew that Fernando Ferrer had a lot to do with it, and he's a great VP, and he did have a lot to do with it. Ed Koch had a lot to do with it. But what kind of turned it around before big power got involved was just local community groups. And the Banana Kelly housing court, I mean, the guys and women who lived on that street and lived in that neighborhood saw the fires coming. They had abandoned Hulk buildings on their street. The buildings belonged to the city, and they were sealed off with cinder blocks. And they just broke the cinder blocks down and rehabbed the buildings with nobody telling them to do it, and nobody telling them, people. It was basically kind of their squatting thing. But they did it themselves in order that those buildings would burn, in order that their own buildings, which also were on that street, wouldn't burn. And those were local people. Those were people who happened to live there. You hear whatever you hear about the Catholic Church was really important in the rebuilding of the Bronx. And these were priests and other Catholic, people in that community who saw their parishes dwindling, and they set about to create a clergy community organization, the Northwest Bronx Community Clergy Council. That is a tricky name to say. Who went around rehabbing buildings, just sort of, nobody's telling her to do it. The city is not yet very much involved. And so if you go around the Bronx, look at who the streets are named after. Where it'll say such and such. I mean, that's here in Manhattan too, but then it'll have the name. Or who is the park named after? You see a park on the Grand Concourse, a little playground, and it's the Evelina Antonetti Playground. Now, I stop and I say, I have to find out who this was. And I did all this reading and checking out and talking to people, and who was she? She's now unfortunately dead. But she was this dynamo. And she's the reason we have bilingual education in New York City schools. I found pictures of her, and in every picture, her mouth is wide open. And that's what she did. And she turned that neighborhood around, and it was her, I think maybe even 100th birthday last year, and they had a whole month devoted at Hostos Community College, devoted to remembering Evelina and Eddie. So, you know, and those names, there are lots and lots of people like that. You look at the sign and you wonder who this was. And then it's easy to find. You can go online and figure out who they were. So that was a big part of how I went about, you know, kind of getting a more granular, if you will, picture of how this place was saved.
Why did you decide that walking was the way to do this book? That was sort of the foundation for your research?
Well, I began this with zero authority. So I didn't live there. I didn't know anything about it. And I wasn't going to move there. I'd written about places, and I never moved to Siberia, never moved to the Great Plains. And so, short of, you know, I guess moving there, how would I get authority? And you get authority by walking the street and by just feeling this place in your calves and in your thighs. Like that, there's a house where John F. Kennedy lived when he was 11 years old. His family moved here in the 20s, and he went to a private school, and I'm not sure which it was, but it was downhill from his house. And his house was right on the cliffs over the Hudson River, and the school was down at the base of the cliff. Just walking from there down to his school, and then walking back, well, that's how John Kennedy, he did it every day. I went to Sonia Sotomayor's house or apartment in Co-op City, and she went to Cardinal Spellman High School, which is like 1.5 miles away. And I thought, okay, and she didn't take the bus. I actually wanted to ask her to be sure I was right about this, and she said thanks, but she's not answering any questions. I guess she's being cautious. But anyway, I walked from her building in Co-op City to Cardinal Spellman High School. And you go over highway after highway, and that's big roads, and you're up on these kind of bridges that go over the highways, and the wind is just whipping it. I went there on a whole day in February, and it was cold and windy, and I think, Sonia Sotomayor, walking along, you know, this is like, I used to have to walk 20 miles. You know how the great men of our 19th century history always had to walk some great distance to school? Well, Sonia Sotomayor had quite a walk. She's a hero. I think she's so great. And I really like her book, which I also recommend, My Beloved World. But so walking was a way of having authority and feeling I know the place a little bit. I know what it's like to walk, you know, there's so many hills, and to walk up, you know, this or the other street in the Bronx or Avenue, and it makes me feel more worth, it makes me feel that I have more authority.
I wondered because I read the book, and I live right now in Hastings, which is just north of, so I take the Metro North through the Bronx every day. And then I learned that you live in Montclair, and I thought, okay, here's a suburbanite reading another suburbanite's book about the Bronx, and how the Bronx was destroyed by, you know, the suburbs, the connection between the suburbs and the city. I mean, do you ever think about that? Like, oh, okay, so here's my place in this ecosystem, and it's not necessarily, you know, the place in the fabric is not necessarily beneficial to the Bronx, you know.
That I live in a place that isn't beneficial to the Bronx?
Well, just by existing and being in a place that people go to.
Is not beneficial, no.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, to the cities, and this is nationwide. But yeah, I think about that. I am, I think, fourth generation suburban. My great grandparents moved from a small town to a suburb of Cleveland at the time that suburbs were sort of starting to begin. And my grandparents and my parents and I all lived in suburbs. And I felt really, really bad about it for years. I thought this is just such a non-place and such a terrible way to grow up. And you don't know, and my father was also somebody who was very careful to remind me at all times that I didn't know anything about real life. Like growing up in Hudson, Ohio, you don't know anything about real life. And my dad had been in the war, and he said, you'll never know what that was. You know, you think, and now I feel better as history goes on. I think I'm getting a better idea of what it was. I mean, when bad things happen, I think, oh, see, Dad, you didn't think I'd have to go through that. But I do feel that it's like a way of life that evolved. New York City had suburbs, I think, before any other American city. And it, you just don't know the damage that it does. And you also, when you're kind of hiding from it, you also don't see what's good about the suburbs. There's a lot good about it. I love Montclair. And looking back at Hudson, I love Hudson too. But I really tried after, you know, I lived in Brooklyn. I lived way out in the woods of Montana. I tried to live in unsuburban places. And maybe Brooklyn kind of is suburban. And of course, I lived in Manhattan for many years. So. But that is, it's interesting to think about. That commute is itself doing some damage. I don't understand why the Bronx just didn't stand up and say, we're putting a toll on the Cross Bronx Expressway. From here to where these 6.5 miles are going to cost you whatever, and it all goes to the Bronx. So I'm for congestion pricing. A Jerseyite is for it.
One last question. I was just thinking about the fires in Los Angeles where I used to live. And it's the only other, I'm missing a lot of data points in saying this, but the only situation in my mind that is as sort of large, all-encompassing and devastating as the fires in the Bronx. And I just wonder if you had any thoughts as people start to think about how on earth they recover in these, pretty densely populated areas that are now just destroyed. Are there any lessons from the Bronx? Are there any comparisons or differences that you would want to think about?
I've been thinking about that myself, and I wanted to see some parallel or some. And I guess the only thing that I can really see is that fire is like an evil god, and it'll get you. It's not. I mean, it's like it has momentum. And the thing with the fires in the Bronx started, and then they got worse and worse and worse, and it had a momentum. And I hate to think of what momentum is building behind these fires in LA. This is a momentum that, when you see fire and it just goes wild, and you can't imagine it. You can't imagine what it will do. And most of us will never see that except in films or on TV. And so I just think it will build momentum, and I don't know enough to know what to talk, what to say about fireproofing or whatever you can do. But if you have dryness and if you have wind in a place like that, the wind is the thing. I did a whole long piece about the fires that burned in western Kansas and Texas Panhandle and Oklahoma, the biggest fires in the world, in the history of the plains anyway, in 2018. And that was just wind, dryness, and the wind will start the fire. So, you know, on the planes, they turn off the power. They did that some in LA too. And maybe land will live without power. I don't know. It's horrifying.
On that cheery note, I think we're ready for I think we're ready for questions. Okay.
Thank you. I grew up in the Midwest Bronx and University Heights neighborhood in the 50s and 60s. There's a lot I'd like to talk to you about the reality on the ground that we didn't hear from you, and that may or may not be in the book. But I was intrigued by the question, if you had to come back for one day, what would it be? There are a lot of days, but I don't know if this is in the book or not. Shortly after the Second World War, a young Italian boy at the end of the Grand Concourse in the Marshaloon neighborhood suddenly had a vision of the Mother Mary and was speaking to her in the street. And according to the newspapers of the time, something like 20 to 30,000 people went up into the neighborhood and followed this kid just with Mary, if you will, for 2 or 3 or 4 days. Must have been an unbelievable event. That's one day I'd like to come back for in the Bronx.
That would be cool.
We didn't have that in my neighborhood, if I can remember.
That's news to me. As are many, many things about the Bronx.
Yes, it's great to see you, and I'm not from the Bronx, but I'm a 1979 graduate of Fordham College at Rose Hill and sold shoes on the Bronx at the concourse in Fordham Road. And I have been cheering for and hoping for the Bronx ever since. And I do want to say that notwithstanding your conversational tone and your sense of humor, I think this is a really important book and such a godsend for that borough. So I thank you for it. I do sort of have a question. I was at a book tour like this with E.L. Doctorow many years ago, and I mentioned to him that I was a big fan of him saying nice things about the Bronx, and pointed out that I had bought the book of Daniel in paperback in a bodega on 194th Street, and there were 3 2-gallon jugs of Tide and maybe a few candy bars, and that was all that was in the store. Now, he had been very evasive with one of the young Sulzbergers and really wasn't answering questions. But when I said this, his head snapped up. And he said to me, 194th Street, he said, was that down the street from Poe Cottage? And I said, yes, it was. And he was very interested in Poe Cottage and then went on a 20-minute soliloquy about the Bronx, which was really amazing. And nobody had expected it because he was being so evasive. And it's not a trick question, but I am supposed to ask questions. Do you know one of the things that would have made him so interested in Edgar Allan Poe?
One of the things that would have made him interested.
E.L. Doctorow, very interested. He's named after Edgar Allan Poe.
I had no idea.
That's probably the only thing about the Bronx that I knew that you
Exactly.
didn't. So I'm not trying to be smarty pants, but
There's so much. I always people ask me if I know this or that, and I don't usually. I mean, I know some, but that's totally one on me. And was that because his parents lived there and they knew about Poe?
It was. I hope the Times has it recorded because he would not answer the Sulzbergers about who his favorite 10 authors were. But after this, he said, "But I will tell you who my favorite 10 Bronx authors were." He brought up Don DeLillo and Richard Price. I don't think he got to Mary Higgins Clark. But then he finished talking about his father commuting into Manhattan from the Bronx, and his father owned a record store and had extended credit to a young record nut who happened to be John Hammond. And so it was. So I hope the Times kept that tape. And I wasn't trying to steal your thunder. I love the book. I started I was listening to some of the early hip hop last night, and I'm really a jazz guy. I know they're related, but you've done great things for me and anyone who's read the book. I've been giving it away.
Wow. Thank you. And I have to say, Fordham is another institution that came off really well. And their Bronx African American History Project, which is findable online, is really great.
Well, thank you for everything.
You're welcome.
I'll bring it up there after this. Yeah, hi. My mother grew up in the Bronx, east 138th Street, between Brook and Willis. And, you know, I've been there, and her buildings, believe it or not, are still in existence on that street. Her father, my grandfather, was a cobbler on that street. Didn't live long enough to see the Bronx change. But one of the things that I would love to have done was to go to Freedom Land. And I know what replaced it. So the question I have is, can you give us a little bit of your feelings about how much of the rest of the Bronx migrated to this new utopian co-op city when Freedom Land went down?
Well,
Thanks.
I mean, I was amazed to see that Freedom Land was laid out in the outline of the continental United States. And it's almost like they're saying, okay, we're the continent, we're going to put the continent right here. And you went from one part with the Chicago fire to I don't know, a cowboy scene somewhere. I mean, and I have also heard that Freedom Land was part of an elaborate scam to get that land cheap. They were going to put an amusement park and failed deliberately. So I don't know, it was too complicated. But Co-op City was kind of a way to deal with pressures that were already being felt in the Bronx and say, oh, you don't like it here on Willis Avenue? You can come up here. And thousands of middle class, mostly white, mostly Jewish citizens of the Bronx went up to Co-op City, and people will say that did almost as much damage as the Cross Bronx Expressway because it took all kinds of middle class businesses and institutions and stuff and just denuded the neighborhoods of all these useful things, and you suddenly had to go, take a bus somewhere to find a laundromat, or that it really changed the Bronx. So, I've actually done a couple pieces. I wrote a piece about Co-op City some years ago, and I kind of like Co-op City. I don't feel like, and now it's mostly people of color, as I would say from just having walked around up there. But a good example again is, Selena Sotomayor, who's a nurse and is supporting 2 kids by herself after her husband dies. She manages to get enough money to buy a co-op in Co-op City. And it really changed. It really helped the family enormously. So many people, I have had people sing the theme song from Freedom Land to me. And I talked to a number of people who went to Freedom Land. It is kind of amazing that was what was there before. But you can never tell in New York. There's always, real estate is so powerful in New York that if somebody tells you that they did that, that Co-op City was a scam, I don't know. Co-op City definitely, had its own problems once it was being built. But it's really, it takes a long time before you realize that real estate in the city is writhing under you. It's like you're riding on some kind of writhing snake or something, and it's just going to toss you off at some point. And it's no coincidence that we now have a president who was a real estate tycoon. It's in New York City. Anyway.
Hi, first of all, I want to thank you for your books. The Great Plains is probably one of my favorite books of all.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask, I just bought the book, so I haven't read it yet. if you had any discussion about the Bronx accent, which is so unique from the Brooklyn accent, and how the Bronx accent came about. If that's anything you've ever thought about before. Because I went to a high school, I went to Stuyvesant, so I could think of when someone talks, I could figure out what borough they're from, because I think of someone with that accent. And it's just so different, the Bronx accent from the Brooklyn accent. And I just...
You know, I am not, my ear is not good enough to pick that out, I'm afraid. I mean, I know that it is a different accent. I would say now, there's so many different accents that are of where English is not the first language, where to me, that's really fascinating now too. Is like when I hear an announcer on the train, and I can say that is definitely West Indian. That's a West Indian accent. But then there are people that can tell you among West Indian accents which is which. So I was very interested reading in the Revolutionary War, which isn't quite your question, but when Major Andre, who was the spy for the British, who was caught by the Continental Army, the way he was caught was that he went and was talking to these guys and said, "Oh yeah, by the way, I've just been spying." I mean, it wasn't quite that straight ahead, but he was talking to them, assuming that they were British, that they were on his team. And so that means that the accents were not that different. And I've read things that Washington has written about his, campaigns there, and he wrote the Bronx River. He spelled it B-R-U-N-X. We had to cross the Bronx. Well, that means to me, Washington probably had a British accent. So, I mean, it's kind of equally interesting to me when there suddenly was where does it come from? An accent? Where does a Bronx accent?
That's right. Maybe that's something to look into for it.
I'd be very interested to hear, to put a Bronx accent next to a Brooklyn
Oh,
accent.
it's very different. I want to also, this is not a question, I just want to also tell you that I'm a fan of the narrative writing, but also of your humor, which is, and it sometimes, comes out in the books as well, but it just seems like it's two different, you kind of toggling sometimes, and I'm like, wow, this is coming out of the same writer. So.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's, each one makes me want to do the other for some reason. I mean, I have a very powerful kind of other voice at all times. I suppose all of us do, but it's just like, when you're sitting in church or something, and suddenly there's just, forget about this. Why are we doing this? This is absurd. And you just shut up. But then, when you write a humor piece, you can let that voice speak.
Hi. Thanks for going to the Bronx and writing about the Bronx. I'm a Bronx native, and I also work in the Bronx. I was wondering, how long do you walk a neighborhood so that you feel comfortable talking about it, especially since a lot of neighborhoods have changed in terms of boundaries and people there and just general history?
I didn't, I walked all over the place, and I would walk for 15 miles in a day, and sometimes more. But I couldn't hope, in the same way I couldn't, I wish I had heard about the guy who saw Jesus. I would have tried to put it in, and my book would be 10 times long. People already tell me it's, that I couldn't figure out, I couldn't get a sense of every neighborhood by any means. I could walk through it. You could walk all around Arthur Avenue. I didn't have much of a sense of Arthur Avenue. I found places that I really liked. So one is Playground 52, and I write a lot about Playground 52, and that's in the South Bronx, and it's near Kelly Street. Kelly is one of the borders of it, in fact. And to me, I would try and get that place so that I felt I do have a sense of this, and I see people who I've seen before. So, and I talk to people and I get to know people. And I do that with limited neighborhoods. I would say, I did a whole lot right up by where Cool Herc lived, which I think is 1520 Sedgwick. And the thing that is so amazing about that is it's right next to the Washington Bridge, which is next to the Hamilton Bridge, which is next to High Bridge. And all these three bridges are right there. You can go down from High Bridge, and walk along Sedgwick, you walk under Hamilton Bridge, you walk under Washington Bridge. Hamilton Bridge is the Bronx, it is I-95. You walk under those bridges, which are just, these thundering things, and then you come up just like a block from that, and there's Cool Herc's building, and it's still another block, should be there. But I would do that enough that I would just get a feeling of what was here. And sometimes it would be real chaos. That area could be real chaos down there. It was just really just abandoned motorhomes on their sides, and all kinds of crazy things in there. So it's more like I find a place that I like and I do it over and over. I did the Carter route, which is a 10-mile route. He came up on the Willis Avenue Bridge, or the 3rd Avenue Bridge, and then went up the Grand Concourse, and then came back and went through Petona Park and went over to Boston Road. And that walk, I probably did a dozen times. And so I would notice changes along that walk, and there was stuff I could have written about it, I didn't. But just things that, how they changed over this time. I like to go places over and over and see them. So that's kind of how I proceeded, but I could only hope to do a few neighborhoods. So.
All right, we have time for one more question. Sorry, over here.
I went to Freedom Land many times when lived in Bronx. I had a great time there. As I remember, they had kind of a low-lying place that you can jump over and maybe not pay to get in, and we used to enjoy doing that. But my memory is that Freedom Land closed because, to look this up, this was way back, because there was a lot of inside robberies there, and over a matter of, I think it was only open 2 years, but I'm going to go back and check that. But my question is a little different. In terms of the decline of the Bronx, can you talk about the political policy issues that led to the decline of the Bronx? Because when I grew up in the Bronx, I thought the political leadership was quite good with Herman Badillo and Robert Abrams and David Ross. Stanley Friedman is an exception to that. But so I thought the Bronx, especially in the days of the Board of Estimate, could hold its own and try to keep the Bronx in better shape. So what happened?
The Bronx was really strong politically. It was a place that could deliver, presidencies in theory. And FDR made a case, would go there, what was his name? Michael Flynn? Flynn, the guy who was the political leader of the Bronx for many years, they say is the origin of the phrase "in like Flynn." Like if Flynn was for you, you were going to be all right. There was a lot of corruption, and it wasn't something it was just kind of a mess. What was it, the Wet scandal or something like that? It was just, it did really kind of degenerate at the same time that the physical plant was degenerating. So I do feel that it has, I like the current political leadership, and as I say, Fernando Ferrer was like one of the best political leaders I know in New York history. So the really bad scandal years I kind of looked away from. So try to accentuate the positive ones.
Well, I think that's all. I'll do the outro. Thank you so much.